Hi again. I'm Ben Minteer from the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University, and today's topic is cities, climate change, and ethics. And what I want to do today is to give you some context for the discussion around the changing roles, opportunities for cities in climate change mitigation. Also, to have a little bit of a conversation about some of the projected impacts of climate change on cities and the agendas of adaptation within cities to climate change. In doing so, however, what I want to do is focus in particular on the ethical and justice-related dimensions of climate change in the urban context. And as we'll see, climate change raises all sorts of ethical questions that are quite difficult and in a way quite fascinating, but certainly hard to grapple with. It's clear, just a perusal of the media, the national media here, let's say in the United States, New York Times and so forth, that cities are increasingly seen as leaders in climate change adaptation and also climate change mitigation. And so Chicago is preparing long-term climate change adaptation plans to anticipate future change. New York City has in recent years spent many resources and a good deal of political effort to create climate change panels that will advise the city on climate adaptation strategies. And increasingly, cities are seen as occupying a niche in climate leadership that many have said has been vacated by nation states. And so there's a lot of attention these days to cities, global cities, the C40 Climate Leadership Group, which we'll talk about briefly, taking the lead around climate mitigation to actually reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Cities, of course, are one of the great sources of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And so therefore, this leadership moment is quite significant in terms of urban sustainability, climate change responsibility, climate change ethics, and so on. So some of the questions I'd like you to think about when we examine climate change ethics in cities are, what role can cities play in mitigating and adapting to climate change? And often mitigation strategies, to reduce greenhouse or control greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation strategies to take anticipatory steps to deal with potential climate impacts often go hand in hand. There's sometimes a debate about whether at the policy level we should focus primarily on mitigation or whether we should focus on adaptation as strategies to address climate change. I think the consensus, the emerging consensus, seems to be that we need to focus on both for very good reasons. Secondly, what particular impacts will climate change be expected to have on urban areas? And how can we achieve a kind of resilience and adaptation posture toward climate change that will reduce societal risk over the long run? And finally, what I'm going to focus on really toward the second half of the few minutes we have here today is the ethical questions that are raised by human-caused or anthropogenic climate change, and in particular the challenges those questions pose, the challenges that climate change poses in particular to traditional discussions of ethical responsibility, and perhaps some of the hard questions that an ethical framework regarding climate change would ask of all of us as consumers, as citizens, as urban dwellers, as nation states. So it's clear to me that we can kind of see this development of an uptick or a crescendo in the scientific assessments around anthropogenic climate change in terms of trends in global warming, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the international scientific body that advises policymakers around climate change. Their most recent report in 2007 suggested that basically 80% growth between 1970 and 2004 in terms of greenhouse gases, and moreover, they declared in very infamous language now that the warming of the climate system is, in their words, unequivocal, and that it's evident from a number of sources. The concern here, of course, is that we are doing this and that human-forced climate change will have a number of consequences for us and for future generations, for wildlife and plants, for economies, for our very survival. Whether we're talking about sea level rise, or we're talking about the spread of infectious diseases or extreme weather events, this is a trend that could be quite troubling, quite problematic for many values that we care about in cities and around the world and in other environments. So the urban leadership component here seems to be key, given the role of cities in greenhouse gas emissions, given the increasing urban profile of most of the world. Half the world today lives in urban areas. This is expected to grow to 70% or so by mid-century. And the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group was established in 2005 to draw together in a network more than 50 cities worldwide to focus on greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies via clean energy measures, retrofitting buildings, public transportation planning, and so forth. So this is an example where cities have taken the lead or in the process of taking the lead in terms of greenhouse gas emission mitigation. At the same time, we can have a discussion about the impacts of climate change on city and the challenges for adaptation to those impacts in addition to mitigation of greenhouse gases. And this is something, I'm recording this here today a couple days after a large storm, Sandy, impacted the northeastern part of the United States. And while it's not clear exactly what the role of climate change was in generating this storm, there is certainly a fair amount of discussion about that right now. It is clear that massive storm events, unusual weather events, sea level rise, and so forth are increasingly of concern to those who live in urban areas, coastal areas in particular, and that climate change inevitably will be playing a role in these kinds of events in the future. Sea level rise is certainly one impact. Extreme events such as floods or heat waves or storm surges on infrastructure is another concern. Health effects due to temperature shifts, higher temperatures, or extreme events also have caused great concern in recent years. There are effects on energy use, especially heating and cooling, and effects on water availability and water resources. So there are many kinds of concerns, or many kinds of impacts that climate change could and perhaps is already having on cities. And these impacts have led many to suggest that what we need to do is to develop an urban climate adaptation strategies, city by city. And so cities have taken the lead, and many cities have taken the lead in doing this. And we can really describe this in terms of the efforts to increase the adaptive capacity of urban areas to be more resilient to climate change. These can include practices such as the creation of green roofs to deal with the urban heat island effect or energy efficiency, tree planting, the development of green infrastructure. There are many kinds of design, planning, and other sorts of interventions that could be followed under this adaptation strategy that could allow citizens, communities, cities to adapt to climate change impacts and to be more resilient and to reduce societal risk as a result. Considering all of this, impacts, mitigation opportunities, the role of cities in creating the problem in the first place, many environmental ethicists and many social and political philosophers have focused on the normative and ethical questions surrounding climate change as a matter of responsibility, as a matter of harm, as a matter of benefit, as a matter of obligation. And so we can really ask questions about adaptation and mitigation from an ethical point of view, whether we're talking about cities in particular or we're talking more generally about national or international policy. There are many ethical concerns that are raised by global climate change. I mean, one would certainly be intra-generational justice, or justice between nations, justice between communities regarding the differential impacts or the vulnerability of different areas of the world to climate shifts. Low-lying island nations certainly will be more vulnerable to sea level rise and perhaps less able to adapt given their economic state than developed nations, for example, or developed regions. Many have suggested that this raises fundamental questions of equity and human rights and the imbalances among the stakeholders in climate change, which of course are all of us. A second dimension, ethical dimension raised by climate change is intergenerational justice, or justice between the present and the future. And the idea here, of course, is that the future may bear more of the burden of climate change, given predicted impacts of climate change over the long run, and that the current generation, us, we are enjoying the spoils of development and consumption and so forth, and we may have obligations to modify and to constrain our behaviors based upon our duties to future generations. And finally, we could say there are more conventional environmental ethics questions that are raised by climate change, including our duties to other species, to biodiversity. The polar bear, for example, is on the front line of climate change, habitat being eroded by global warming. And so this would be a concern based around a more nature-centered ethic that climate change has impacts there that are quite significant. Many philosophers who have written about climate change in recent years have suggested that climate change itself actually is a real challenge for our traditional ways of thinking about ethics and responsibility and harm. The philosopher Dale Jamieson at NYU has suggested that, in fact, the dominant ethical and value system of the West is really inadequate for thinking about global climate change. And Jamieson argues that the traditional view presupposes that harms and their causes are individual, we can identify them easily, and they are local in space and time. That's the kind of traditional paradigm of ethics. With climate change, though, Jamieson suggests that seemingly innocent acts can have devastating consequences. It's not as if people are actively trying to hurt other people now or in the future, but the actions following consumption and the consequences can be quite devastating. The causes and harms can be quite diffuse over time and space. And the diffuse nature of the harms, the global and the kind of accumulating nature of the harms, in turn can play out over multiple scales. And so this really challenges traditional ethical understandings of you hurt me, that was wrong, and you have a responsibility to make it right. The you hurt me part now is global, it's intergenerational, and it's incredibly complex because we're dealing with Earth systems. Some philosophers have suggested, and this again is appropriate given the weather event that was just experienced here in the United States, that climate change ethics is really a perfect moral storm. The philosopher Stephen Gardner suggests that global climate change brings together three challenges to ethical action. And one he calls the global challenge, which he means that this is a problem that is global in scale. Certainly it is not localized to a region or to a nation even. There's this challenge of understanding intergenerational responsibility, so there's an intergenerational challenge, and there's a theoretical challenge in that we haven't worked out precisely a lot of these ethical theories around obligations to other species and to future generations. The convergence of these three challenges, Gardner argues, actually is employed by those who would argue for inaction on climate change. It is employed as a reason to not act, to do something on climate change. So this is, according to Gardner, a real example of potential moral corruption around the response regime to climate change. There are many ethical arguments for climate action, and you have a reading by Gardner and Hartzell where they basically suggest that there is this kind of ethical consensus around climate change, that there are going to be serious global, intergenerational, and ecological impacts to climate change, and that there is this important consensus that ethical action is imperative here for citizens, for nations, and for the community of nations. And so this is really seen as an aspect of moral responsibility that is quite significant. The philosopher Peter Singer, in terms of responsibility and fairness, puts it very bluntly and says, look, and this is his book, One World, to put it in terms that a child could understand, as far as the atmosphere is concerned, the developed nations broke it. If we believe, according to the polluter pays, that you should contribute to fixing something in proportion to your responsibility for it, then the developed nations have a responsibility to take the lead on climate change response. A very egalitarian and very equity-oriented view. There are a number of issues surrounding urban climate vulnerability and equity in terms of the specific context of cities and climate change ethics. Rosenzweig et al. Argue that hotter weather and more intense events will impact cities differently, and that there will be disparate urban hazards and vulnerabilities and varying ability to respond or to adapt to rapid climate change, and that this in turn can raise very profound concerns of environmental justice, that poor, elderly, and other vulnerable populations in developed areas, and this can be in developed areas certainly, but also in less developed areas, may be especially vulnerable to climate impacts. So there's an equity issue here that is fundamental to reducing societal risk and understanding differential vulnerability to climate change in cities that's quite compelling. So I'll leave you with some questions for further discussion, and one of those certainly would be, why do you think cities have been more proactive in addressing climate change than national governments? Secondly, if there's an ethical consensus to do something about climate change, why haven't we made much policy and political progress on this issue in recent years? Do you agree with folks like Singer, with moral philosophers like Singer, who believe that developed regions have an obligation to lead the world in climate stabilization efforts? And finally, in what ways is your own city vulnerable to climate change? Are there populations within your city that are especially at risk due to climate impacts? These are the kinds of questions I'd like you to think about as you're working through the material for this week.